to break down subsecular arts, you obviously need to explain the subsecular part perhaps more than the art thing, which I think most people are more familiar with. This idea or concept was something I sort of invented to put a name on something that I discovered while I was working on my doctoral thesis. And it springs from the idea of people talking about a post-secular condition, and a lot of people use post-secular as a term, but it's not really clear what it is. Different people fill it with different meanings. But in the end, I felt like all the different versions of the post-secular still wanted some kind of secular power to dictate what kind of role religion or spirituality could have in politics and where it is sort of allowed in society. This term was perhaps mainly popularized by Jürgen Habermas, and he's gotten a lot of critique saying exactly that this is just another sort of secular project of dominance, prescribing a certain place for religion. So if we want to think about religion and politics today, especially in Sweden, I shouldn't make universal claims about this, but in Sweden, I think it's more fitting to talk about a sub-secular condition, meaning that religion and spirituality and sort of the deepest beliefs that people hold, they are prescribed a place. It's certainly a place outside of politics, and it's given a very, very marginal place in the public sphere. And in my thesis, this is also something that my respondents bear witness to. They feel like being religious is something that they, other people see them as suspicious, even though they might be members of the Church of Sweden, which is a huge church, and it's not exactly like it's doing some kind of things that people don't really know what it is in the shadows. It's the main church. It used to be the State Church of Sweden, but even then, it's like either you have ulterior motives when you engage in the public sphere or in social work, or there is other reasons for being suspicious, or you're just seen as rather dumb. So those seems to be the options. So then I started to think about the secular and the religious in terms of dominance and submission, and then the subsecular was the term that I kind of felt captured the fact that any kind of religiosity or spirituality is sort of forced into submission, right?
The subsecular aims to conceptualize the experience of religion being forced into submission by a hegemonic secular culture. Attempts have been made over the years to speak of a post-secular condition and the return of God, to critique the secularization thesis and to emphasize the continuous role religion plays in culture, politics, and so on. But while the post-secular implies an understanding of religion and spirituality, which at best is defined by the contours of the secular, the subsecular breaks open the discourse on religion to liberate human spirituality. Rather than allowing for secular society and its established values to dictate the terms for what religion could be, the subsecular accentuates the Spinozist notion that we do not know what a body can do. philosopher Gilles Deleuze writes, "The slave only conceives of power as the object of a recognition, the content of a representation, the stake in a competition, and therefore makes it depend at the end of a fight on a simple attribution of established values." This is how post-secular religiosity has come to relate to power, and it has thus turned its will to power upon itself. The will to power, according to Deleuze, has its highest level in an intense form, which is neither coveting nor taking, but giving, creating. More than simply conceptualizing the experience of religion being forced into submission by a dominant secular culture, the subsecular also describes a move away from a spirituality motivated by resentment that depend on established values towards a spirituality of the future, which is indifferent to the outer boundaries of any hegemonic culture. The subsecular language of domination and submission draws inspiration from the world of BDSM. The aim is to make clear that the submissive partner is in fact the one controlling the action. One could argue that safe words are not effective as subsecular people exit their spiritual dungeons to go on with their lives in secular societies. This is of course true, but the intention is not to demand a safe space, but to encourage a mindset of differential affirmation and radical self-expression, which is indifferent to hegemonic systems.
And so this event that we're having out in the Swedish countryside in the region of Östergötland this summer, that is just, calling that subsecular arts is just like an invocation to bring whatever you feel is the most pertinent for you. It can be like, I just want to have genuine meetings with people and eat waffles, or I want to go for a swim and then dance to techno music in the evening, or let's build a jam corner, or just run between a philosophical debate and a space for cuddling and being close to other people, and then back to the philosophy again, and sort of just doing those two, or whatever you like, whatever you feel is sort of honest expressions that you long for, that you think is integral to being, and that you would want to do more of, essentially. So that is just like a space where you're allowed to express this kind of spirituality, religion, yearning, belief. It can only also be like for the post-atheist movement that kind of rejects all kind of sort of transcendent forms of deities and that sort of thing. They still think that this kind of getting together and playing and sort of just the form of being together is sort of the thing with religion that they feel like we can't live without this. We can certainly live without the Judeo-Christian or Abrahamic God, but we can't live without a community where there is a certain amount of freedom of expression and creativity and sort of a genuine meeting place.
Henri Bergson talks about the absolute, or he says that an absolute can only be given in an intuition, while the rest has to do with analysis. And I think, the analysis part there is sort of our beliefs, but they need to have a source. They need to come from the earth. They need to have a pulse. They need to have a rhythm. And so when you talk about techno music and religion and people coming together, forming communities in alternative ways, in a sense challenging the ways we're supposed to organize ourselves when we get together. I think there's one way you can take there and go politically and talk about what this means politically, and perhaps we can. But I'm interested in hearing what you think about how we experience life together and how that becomes the foundation for how we articulate our beliefs.
So let me backtrack to when you were talking about, the intuition and the analysis. And I think that I have certainly been doing this for a long time. And I think a lot of people in, our modern society is guilty of the same thing. We are very good at rational thinking. We're very good at analysis, but, even allowing the space for that, where intuition can be, recognized, where we can sort of perceive that, okay, there's something going on here that I want to pick up, at all. I think that, as a society, I think that, this preparing space for the intuition to come to us is, essentially what you could call a ritual. The interesting thing with all rituals is that they're always going to be primed in some way or another. Like, if you're performing a Christian ritual, there's going to be a certain, theological context. You're going to be in a certain space, like some kind of church that is awe-inspiring and that sort of thing. And it sort of it really primes how you will perceive God in that place. And I think that, to make something like a, living religion, then, we need to challenge the metaphors that we're using. We need to challenge the priming when we go into rituals. We need to just sort of go out of the usual places and just go out into somewhere where we haven't, we don't have to discard our beliefs, but just sort of priming ourselves by putting us in a completely different context, that will certainly tweak the experience more than just a little. And I think this is really interesting when it comes to, Burning Man, which is the largest participatory festival in the world that gathers around, I think, 80,000 people a year in the middle of nowhere in Nevada, in the Black Rock Desert. They have a sort of principle program of 10 short principles that, prime people enough to essentially get along for this period of time, building a city out of nowhere, being there, celebrating whatever it is you're celebrating and exploring whatever it is you want to explore, and then just dismantling everything and leaving there as if no one ever came. And I just think it's fascinating with these, that it can be 10 really quite simple but still powerfully priming principles that just set the tone for the whole thing.
Our city is saturated with ritual, and people don't talk about that. They talk about how wild and crazy it is, how it pushes boundaries, how it's innovative, engine of innovation, and all this stuff. And I guess that's radical enough, pushing boundaries, going where no one's been, the new. But it's really about also, in equal force, the old. It's about the other side of what radical means. Radical means pushing boundaries, but it's a very funny word. Its root is radix, which means root. And radical, the word also means whatever is deeply situated in our nature. What is innate, what is soulful, what is interior. It means both those things at once, and our city means both those things at a time. I keep wondering if people will finally ask me, well, this radical expression and radical self-reliance, what's all this radical stuff in the principles? What does that mean? Well, it in some sense, it means that people can live in the moment there, but at the same time, they do so in contemplation of continuities of time that extend all the way back, to the beginning, say your birthday, when you came into this world as a being, and all the way forward, potentially, into the future, and that future that if you live long enough, then you very much hope to affect.
I think one of the principles is immediacy. And I think that's what we've sort of been touching upon a little bit here.
Yeah.
With the Bergson, when he says that about intuition, I think he also says that the complexity of the letter should not allow for the simplicity of the spirit to be lost to view.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of getting at the same thing, but we have a tendency to be caught up in analysis or the complexity of the letter. And that moves, in a sense, in an eternal realm, because it's a staticness, it's a slowness. There's not much movement going on there, and so when you end up there, as many do today, I think, you start infinitely divide yourself against each other. You have this sort of antagonistic understanding about language and how it functions, and you get caught up in it, and you start making divisions into sort of fascist small sects, and I think that's completely the wrong way to go. So this is a counter move, in a sense, because rather than getting caught up in the complexity of the letter, we affirm the simplicity of the spirit and the intuitiveness of just coming together and expressing ourselves. I think there's another principle called radical expression, self-expression, something like that.
Yeah, I think maybe we should read through these, because these reads like I think it's an interesting piece of theology, if you will. I've got them in front of me, so I thought I can just sort of read them from start to finish.
Yes.
The different ones. Okay, principle number 1, radical inclusion. Anyone may be part of, Burning Man in this case, yeah. We welcome and respect the stranger. No prerequisites exists for participation in our community. Principle number 2, gifting. Burning Man is devoted to acts of gift giving. The value of a gift is unconditional. Gifting does not contemplate a return or an exchange for something of equal value. Principle number 3, decommodification. In order to preserve the spirit of gifting, our community seeks to create social environments that are unmediated by commercial sponsorship, transactions, or advertising. We stand ready to protect our culture from such exploitations. We resist the substitution of consumption for participatory experience. Principle number 4, radical self-reliance. Burning Man encouraging the individual to discover, exercise, and rely on his or her inner resources. Principle number 5, radical self-expression. Radical self-expression arises from the unique gifts of the individual. No one other than the individual or a collaborating group can determine its contents. It is offered as a gift to others. In this spirit, the giver should respect the rights and liberties of the recipients. Principle number 6, communal effort. In our community, values creative cooperation and collaboration. We strive to produce, promote, and protect social networks, public spaces, works of art, and methods of communications that support such interactions. Principle number 7, civic responsibility. We value civil society. Community members who organize events should assume responsibility for public welfare and endeavor to communicate civic responsibilities to participants. They must also assume responsibility for conducting events in accordance with local, state, and federal laws. Principle number 8, leaving no trace. Our community respects the environment. We are committed to leaving no physical trace of our activities wherever we gather. We clean up after ourselves and endeavor, whenever possible, to leave such places in a better state than when we found them. Principle number 9, participation. Our community is committed to a radically participatory ethic. We believe that transformative change, whether in the individual or in society, can occur only through the medium of deeply personal participation. We achieve being through doing. Everyone is invited to work, everyone is invited to play, We make the world real through actions that open the heart. And then the 10th and last principle is, like you said, immediacy. Immediate experience is, in many ways, the most important touchstone of value in our culture. We seek to overcome barriers that stand between us and the recognition of our inner selves, the reality of those around us, participation in society, and contact with the natural world exceeding human powers. No idea can substitute for this experience. So we end pretty much where your quote began.
Yeah, they obviously go into one another, these different principles. And it's interesting, that you're also trying to sort of create a subsecular monastery at the same place where you're holding this event this summer. So this reads to me as a kind of monastic rule.
Yeah.
Updated for the 21st century. And I think this is something that, whatever his name, Larry Harvey, right?
Yeah.
Is that he wrote as sort of not as a rule, but as a way of saying how they had been working together. So it's not to dictate. It's to encourage and help people. And so I think there could be an interesting conversation about the 10 principles, about how to not only how do we apply these principles when we get together, but how can we develop them? And are there perhaps other principles from the monastic tradition that could be updated and added to these principles?
Right. Yeah. The whole idea of a monastery, it's a little bit more in the future than the immediate event that's coming up now. And essentially the work there, as I see it, is doing two things. It's the boring thing, which is just like finding a financial model that works, so we can keep it going. The other one is really just finding out who wants to get involved, because that is the basis here. We haven't set up a sort of, okay, everyone who believes in these theological truths or this kind of dogma, they are welcome to join and the rest will stay out. But rather this is I suppose the intention is to form a monastery where we also form the principles that we that makes us gather, and just try to develop that in a sense where we take different traditions seriously, at the same time as not being exclusionary on the basis of it. Because I know that there's both the sort of nihilist make your own religion type of people that are interested in this project, and there's also people who consider themselves to be devout Christians. And I think that something that I've really gotten from my from my 10 years of studying theology and philosophy is that there's such a richness to that. Just sort of probing one particular culture can take you such a long time, and there's such a richness in that. I think that for anyone, it would be humbling and fantastic to have anyone that's been, delving into deep and rich tradition and sort of finding things in there that has taken them a long time to shape or mold, or sort of think about how can you practice this in a in contemporary society. That is also a kind of the aim, at least, is aiming at this first principle, radical inclusion, to start with, to see where can that go, what kind of monastery could that be. I think that's hugely important and hugely needed today.
I think so too. I obviously have some thoughts about inclusion, and I'm against it, but
Well, do tell.
I think I've talked about this on the podcast before, that the notion of inclusion builds on the presupposition of exclusion.
Right,
so
right.
you keep the border in place when you talk about inclusion, and ultimately even, the willingness to accept everyone else into your own room is sort of based on the idea that they become like you. I think you could see it in the inclusion of gay people. In society. Okay, it's okay, we affirm your gayness, but now you're expected to build a house and raise a family, and
now you're allowed to marry, so settle down in the suburbs with a Volvo in the house, why don't you?
pretty much. So it becomes sort of the notion of inclusion becomes a territorialization of people that was in the past these sort of trickstery kind of people running around doing things that was erupting novelties in society. So I think we miss something when I mean, I understand the notion of inclusion is good. I prefer inclusion before exclusion, but I think that we might get caught up in a way of reasoning that actually presuppose something that we don't get rid of, but that's just parentheses to this. What I was thinking of, what we said about the subsecular, that spiritual people, religious people, call them what you want, shouldn't accept the position as a slave to the secular organization of society. So we need to move out. We need to cross the Red Sea, perhaps. Do we need a Moses? Do we need to know where we're going? Or is this just a sort of naive hope that by coming together in the forest, there will be a harmony that comes from nature that moves us to wherever we want to go? Or do we actually need to try to articulate where we want to go? Or is that already articulated within the Burning Man principle program?
I have used the likeness before of being slave or being the submissive, but in a kind of BDSM context, where ultimately it's not the dominant, but it's the submissive that sets the parameters for the whole thing. You negotiate, okay, so what's going to be the boundaries of our encounter now, and the submissive can also have some kind of like a safe word or other means of communicating that, okay, let's stop what we're doing right now, let's stop the play, and just leave me alone. And I think that that's how we should view ourselves in regards to this prescribed place that we are being pushed into. We should see it as well, we're accepting this role. It's not that someone is pushing us down and we're making resistance and we're getting nowhere. We're actually not making any resistance. We are in the scene. We're not using our safe words at the moment. And in a democratic society, no one else has the right to point at you and say, well, your beliefs are worth less than mine. No, that's in a as long as the democratic system with voting and all that, as long as that works, then we do have a level of power that we're not seizing at the moment. And I think the first step to sort of realizing that and actualizing that power is doing that in venues where it's kind of safe and also empowering. Then I'm talking about safe as in there's no clash between the sort of someone on the political level saying that this is your place, But in a burner community, at a participatory event, things like that, then it's actually a place where we're not in submission, but we're testing out these things. And I think, the testing grounds and feeling that, okay, this actually works on a small scale. There's nothing that doesn't say that we can scale this up in one way or another. And the scaling up can be that I started doing this instead of like once or twice a year, I'm doing it once or twice a month, or I start living in a sort of subsecular activist monastery, or I'm doing something like that, which has to do with frequency and habit. Or it can also be that, these things that we're doing becomes examples that we then sort of throw out into the world and say, well, deal with this, look at what we can do. Look at, when we have total freedom of expression in a forum where everything is just prepared for us to go crazy, this is what happens. Are you still afraid?
I just want to clarify the quote that read from Deleuze when he talks about how a slave only conceives of power as the object of recognition. It's the Nietzschean understanding about the slave versus the master morality. He also talks about established values. So I think, he talks about this kind of slave morality and the notion of power that comes from that. Because power for Deleuze is not about conceiving power as an object of recognition. The will to power, the highest level or notion of will to power, according to Deleuze, when he reads Nietzsche, is creation and giving. When you look at society, and you still have, we're in some kind of transition from capitalism to informationalism, but what capitalism does to us is that it territorializes us and subjectifies us and makes us to be in relation to a lack. And so being is something else. When you read the principles, being is in the doing, right? In what we do when we get together. In capitalism, we're fostered to think of ourselves as being of lack. And so we need to always fill that lack with a new car, a new house, a new boat, or whatever. And I think, this is revolutionary in that sense, because it removes that aspect that is so dominant in the rest of society by saying this is not about to fill the lack. This is about gifting rather than trying to make profit out of someone else's labor. It opens up for a way of expressing yourself and the excess of you. Walt Whitman says, "Do I contradict myself? Very well, I do contradict myself. I am vast. I contain multitudes." I love that. And I think, that's true of everyone. That's true of all people. We contain multitudes, but we're territorialized in a sense that doesn't allow for that to be expressed. And so this radical self-expression is that there's so much within us that is contained. We don't use the safe word, but just saying a safe word won't make capitalism stop. We're fucked, literally. I think there's something in this that is sort of trying to create a different way of communicating, of being together and being in relation to one another, in expressing oneself, in being liberated. But my question is, where is it going? Do we know? Is there anyone who's said anything about how this could be translated into an actual vision for the rest of society? Or is this sort of what Zizek said about Buddhism and yoga, that it's an oasis within the capitalist society where you can get your strength back so that you can go back and be a diligent worker? Do you get my point?
Yeah.
Now, if you followed these trends a little bit, you may have noticed something, how Western Buddhism presents itself as the remedy against the stressful tension of capitalist dynamics, allowing us to uncouple from this crazy, frantic rhythm and retain inner peace and enlightenment. But I claim, and you know what gave me to think this? When I read, I don't know in what journal, an interesting analysis of, let's call it, if not religious, spiritual trends among top managers, businessmen today. To cut a long story short, 80% some kind of what they claim, Tibetan, Buddhist, whatever you call it, practicing so-called meditation. And I can understand it, because insofar as if you are really engaged in modern capitalism at its craziest, like it's really, as one of the top managers claimed, that when he studied Buddhist ontology, the way he understood it, the idea being, as you probably know, the fragility of existence. All are fleeting phenomena, everything can fall apart at every point. He said, but this is our market today, no? One rumor, everything falls apart. So he got it correctly, this manager, sorry I forgot his name. He said, if you really want to be fully engaged in this market, you get crazy. So what you need is a kind of a inner distance which tells you, okay, it's a crazy market, to teach you how to participate in it without being fully existentially engaged in it. That's why businessmen like this bullshit.
I mean, I think, first of all, I don't know of any sort of studies that that sort of says, this is definitely where this is going, or it's been transposed into some other form of action, like the Burning Man thing, being nomadic and just sort of territorializing in a different way somewhere else. But I partook in a event called Urban Burn last year. I did it this year as well, but last year I held a workshop where I had sort of a small writing assignment where I asked people to sort of try to think about, not only like what are you resisting with a current status quo, but also if we win, if the resistance wins and whatever we're opposed to doesn't have any power tomorrow, what do you see as the sort of immediate gain? And also, like, one step further, what would be the sort of ideal community, or the ideal society to live in? And even though I could like exemplify things here, just to sort of sum up what I've come across and the different stories, doesn't really give me much of a sort of sense that we're moving in that we're moving in unison, that everyone is perceiving a certain goal and that goal is the same for everyone. And there's also been this discussion within the burner community in Scandinavia, where you see that everyday politics makes its entry into, like, typically if someone wants to do a project for one of these participatory events, then you do it. If you want someone else to join, then you advertise for someone to, like, okay, can you join me and help me do this? And you apply for some kind of art grant sometimes, if that's available. And it's Alexander Bard calls it a duocracy, which I think is a great word for it, where people just, okay, if you want to do your thing, then do your thing. But lately it's been creeping in, like identity politics, where people, like social justice warrior type of people, instead of focusing on like, yeah, I want to do this project, I want to do this artwork, I want to do this installation, they critique the hell out of certain projects that they don't see the merit in. And I think just the fact that in this community, even though this community lives online pretty much like everything else, people react strongly to like, oh wow, someone is coming in and just critiquing things like things usually work on the internet. And even though it's like business as usual with harsh internet comments, people react to it. And I think that in itself is a sign that something has spilled over. The spirit of these events has spilled over into the online world in a sense, where people are gentler towards each other. And when someone comes and brings in a very harsh political perspective and says, call someone out as a fascist or white supremacist or things like that, then people get really offended in a way that they actually wouldn't do if the conversation just took place in a different Facebook group.
Something that I've been pondering a little bit lately is the desire for new values, for the creation of new values, which is something Deleuze and others talk about, and Nietzsche, of course. That we shouldn't settle to just compete over established values, what I've been talking about here today. But I also sense that within the same community interested in events like yours, there are people that seems to believe that's not the way to go, because I sense there's a rise of social conservatism as well. And so I think there's a tension for me there. The social conservatism and the hedonistic spirituality searching for novelties. And perhaps that's an interesting divide of people coming together, sort of like the Dionysians and the Apollos. but where is the emphasis? I'm not even sure that's a relevant question.
Yeah, but I thought about something that you said when you were talking about the fostering us to perceive a lack, and I think that capitalism is extraordinary at doing that, and I think that when we are taught that we should always strive for some kind of improvement, I think it's easy to start thinking in terms of like, okay, now my spiritual life or my physical body is also a site that should be improved. There's a lack there, and I think that that goes for values as well. So that can be a sort of byproduct. And when we try to break free from a capitalist mindset, then instead of like perceiving a lack in like, oh, I don't have the latest Tesla model or whatever, then it becomes like, oh, I don't have the latest the most optimized body for long meditation retreats, or then the lack is turned onto a sort of spiritual scene. And I think that's also this incessant search that just is ongoing for like, it has to be better values, it has to be more values, it has to be deeper. I think that also does something to us that is, not necessarily conducive at all.
It could go that way if you keep the notion of lack, that you need to fill that, rather than focusing on the excess that is you. If you're caught up in the idea that there's an ideal that you can't live up to, but you want to, even if you would someday have that optimized body for long meditation sessions, the object loses its magic when you get it. So it's never going to work. You're just going to, now I don't have the best body for sumo wrestling.
Yeah.
It's always about that, the attitude towards what's out there. And do you lack it, or is everything actually a multiplicity, and there's there's a possibility for you to express yourself radically, as in one of these principles, so that you can transform yourself and your ideals and your values, and you can do it in a group with other people. And it's exciting, it's experimental, and perhaps we might find a way that is suitable to live in the age we're living in. There's no actual plan for how to do this. That's not what I'm looking for. I think if we're looking for the blueprint, we could go back to, you could go back to your Pentecostal upbringing environment, because they have the blueprint for how they want to live. Equally as, the social democrats in Sweden, they have their ideal, which is maybe, social democracy in the 1980s before the internet. And then you have the Swedish democrats. Their ideal is the social democracy that preceded that era.
Yeah.
They look in the past and they have an ideal and they want to realize it in the future. And I think what's exciting about projects like these is that you can look for ways of communicating with people that are actually living today, not allowing for the complexity of the letter to overshadow the simplicity of our spirit when we come together, but allow for that radical self-expression and all these other principles to come into fruition, and so that we can create something that we find viable and think this is something that we can actually apply outside of this community at a larger scale, and then it can turn political.
I mean, I totally agree with what you're saying, and I had one thing that I wanted to also comment when it came to your description of capitalism, because I have been thinking exactly the same way up until yesterday when I listened to a podcast, the Ezra Klein podcast, where he had Johan Hari as a guest. He talked about capitalism and then divided into two things, where it's like a corporate driven or corporate, where capitalism where you see corporations as the primary unit, whereas communal or community owned or community driven or sort of collectively driven enterprises could be seen as another version, which actually makes a huge difference in terms of a lot of the exploitation that pretty much everyone with a heart is against in capitalism. But actually, if you would switch to thinking that we can still use money and use that in various ways, but the primary mode of organizing the markets is not according to what's best for the flourishing of corporations, and especially big corporations. And I thought that was a very sort of worthwhile thought as well. And I think approaching it in that way wouldn't make Zizek happy, but I think a lot of people could much more easily get on board with the idea that there are things in our system that we can critique and that we should critique, and at the same time, I don't have to imagine a world where we've abolished any kind of currency system, where it's all just gifting, because I don't think that resonates with a lot of people. I don't think that they see that as something, or even if it resonates with them, I think that it's just like placing too much of a vision of a good life too far into the future. Even for those who consider that to be the utopia, I think that we need a much more sort of immediate utopia. The political philosopher William Connolly talks about interim futures, which I think is really good. And I think that this, I've got no idea where all this is going, but I see this as a kind of interim future in the making.
And you don't want to miss it, so go buy your tickets. Where do you get your tickets, Jonatan?
Well, you can search for the event on Facebook, Subsecular Arts 2.0, and then there's also the Swedish, possibly Scandinavian ticket site called Biletto, where you can also search there for Subsecular Arts 2.0.
And I'll put a link on the homepage. I'm going, you're going, and there's another few friends of ours that will be there. Last year we had a philosophy session that went on for quite some time, didn't we?
Yeah, I think it started at 3 in the afternoon and it ended 2:30 in the night. So like 11 and a half hours. I wish that Guinness Book of Records would have been there.
It wasn't planned, but it was
just
up. It was pretty fun, and there was a lot of people there were some younger people that were very interested, and there were some older people that had things to say, and we had a thing on Deleuze that we did organized, and then it just went from there into conversations about everything. So that's one of the things I assume will happen this year as well, something like that. And then there's other things, as Jonathan said before, people creating. This is a co-creative event where people bring what they want to this place out in the Swedish countryside next to a lake, very beautiful, and we just make something fantastic together.
Yeah, I think it's important to say as well that, it's not like we should say that, we're offering these things and we're offering those things, and there will be a little bit of this and a little bit of that.
Maybe that can fill the lack in your lives. Is that what we're saying, Jonathan?
No, but rather, I think it's really important that people who come with a sort of spirit of wanting to give something to other people. I mean, for me, it was like partaking happily in the Deleuze conversation, and then it was, playing sort of techno set on the dance floor. And for one guy, it was, he brought things so he could make waffles, and started that up in the middle of the night, and everyone got super happy. So it doesn't have to be like, it can be Deleuze, it can be waffles, it can be hugs, it can be a jam corner, it can be pretty much anything that you want it to be. And I think that rather than offering something that you get to sort of experience, what you get to experience is essentially a place of freedom and acceptance and curiosity, where other people want to meet you and find out, okay, what are you doing, what aren't you doing, and finding that out together. I think that's it's a unique space to create, whatever you think is
whatever is contained within you.
Yeah, the multitudes.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's it. Thank you, Jonathan.
Thank you, Joseph.